Barrett had been wondering who she was, and now that he knew she was the 5th princess of the Ushif Empire, he started turning his head towards her and began to smile. Seeing this, Eren became somewhat confused as she didn't know why he was reacting this way. Barrett put one hand in his pants pocket, approached her, and while staring into her eyes, started smiling. Then he extended his other hand to shake hands with her and told her that it was an honor for him to meet her, creating tension in the atmosphere. Eren remained silent for several seconds, then she started looking at Barrett with a disdainful look and replied that she didn't feel like shaking hands with him. While the two of them were talking, the boys who were accompanying Barrett approached, put their hands in their pants pockets, and with a smile, stood in front of the brown-haired girl who was sitting on the floor. Eren asked Barrett for an explanation of what was happening. He turned his head towards the girl and while looking at her, he started to smile and told Eren that she had misunderstood. He decided to ask the girl what was going on. Upon hearing this, the girl who was sitting on the floor turned her head towards him and became somewhat confused. Just before she could make a move, Barrett approached her, grabbed her shirt collar, and stood her up. He rested his arm on the girl's shoulder and while staring at her intently, he extended his other hand towards Eren and asked if they were harassing her right now. While the girl covered the wound on her elbow with her hand, with a sad look she began to gaze at the ground and explained to Eren that they were not harassing her. Upon hearing this, she was left speechless. She began to look at the girl with a surprised expression and asked her not to try to hide it since just by looking at her, it was obvious that she was being bullied. While Barrett had his arm resting on the girl's shoulder, she slightly turned her head to the side, looked away from her, and explained that everything was fine. She asked Eren to leave as they were just playing. Upon hearing this, Barrett couldn't help but burst into laughter. He started staring at Eren and asked her if she had heard. He also added that he was starting to become dissatisfied. Eren didn't believe the girl's words. She approached her, and while looking at her with a worried expression, she reached out to her and decided to take her with her. Just before Eren could grab the girl, Barrett grabbed her arm. He distanced himself from the girl and while holding Eren's arm with his hand, he began to stare at her eyes with a murderous look and asked her if she hadn't understood what she had said. Upon seeing this, the brown-haired girl brought her hands to her chest and while looking at Eren, she was left speechless. Seeing that Barrett had grabbed her arm, Eren asked him what this meant. Barrett tightened his grip on her arm even more. He got closer to her and while staring into her eyes, he asked if she hadn't heard Leximus asking her to leave. Eren clenched her teeth tightly and while giving Barrett an aggressive look, she told him that if he didn't let go of her arm right now, she was going to make him pay for this. Just before she could finish speaking, Barrett interrupted her and with a smirk mocked her by calling her a weak little girl. Upon hearing this, Cyan, who was close to them, began to look at Barrett with an aggressive gaze. In the blink of an eye, Cyan descended to the ground and while having one hand in his pants pocket, he kicked Barrett forcefully causing him to release Eren's arm and fall to the ground. As Barrett's body was slowly turning and he was falling towards the ground, he started wondering what was happening. Upon seeing Cyan, Eren was left speechless and couldn't help but blush. As Cyan turned his head to the side, he was surprised. Leximus became terrified and started wondering what was happening. The two boys who were accompanying Barrett began to approach him to help. Cyan started wondering if she really was Leximus. A while ago, in the Garam Kingdom Klein Castle, a battle took place between two swordsmen. One of them was Leximus and the other was Cyan Vert. Leximus attacked Cyan forcefully with her sword, but he simply blocked the attack using the Karam sword. Gaining momentum, he started to distance himself from her. While staring at her intently, he thought that she was the best swordsman on the continent, Leximus Klein. She was originally from the Ushif Empire, but for some reason, after graduating from the academy, she entered Count Kellen's household in the kingdom of Garam and even changed her nationality. She brought the sword close to her face and while staring at Cyan intently, she prepared to attack. Then, gaining momentum, she began attacking Cyan with a series of strikes. Luckily, he was able to block the attacks in time. While Cyan was distracted, Leximus swung the sword forcefully, unleashing a powerful strike towards him that was so strong it started destroying the ground in its path. Cyan managed to react in time, and gaining momentum, he jumped and in the process dodged the attack. While he was in the air, he started looking towards the ground and was shocked. Gaining momentum, in the blink of an eye, Leximus reached Cyan and using her sword, tried to attack him again. Luckily, Cyan reacted in time and dodged the attack at the last second, although part of his cape was cut in the process. Seeing that he had been able to react to the attack, Leximus was shocked. In the blink of an eye, Cyan appeared above her, while slowly descending towards her. He gripped the sword with both hands, and as he prepared to attack her, he began staring at her intensely with a murderous gaze. Leximus noticed Cyan's presence, but it was too late. Just before she could make a move, Cyan forcefully stabbed her in the back with his sword, causing her body to crash heavily onto the ground, shattering into pieces. While Cyan sat on Leximus' back with the sword still embedded in her, she began spitting blood. Several minutes later, once she lost her life, Cyan stood up. With one hand holding Karen's sword, he started staring fixedly at her corpse. He was ordered by the Empire to kill her. His order was to assassinate her. However, once Cyan infiltrated the castle, he ended up having an official duel with her, which had no special reason. She was someone who had reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship without mana. Cyan did not want to silently assassinate someone who had been titled as the best swordsman on the continent. Back in the present, Leximus tightly clenched both fists, and while looking at Cyan, she became surprised and started wondering what was happening. Barrett's friend approached him, crouched down on the ground, and while looking at him with a surprised expression, caught his attention and asked him to get in order. Barrett began to stand up and asked his friend to step aside, which left him somewhat confused. As he slowly stood up, he started wondering why there were so many nosy bastards today. Cyan simply turned his head towards him and silently stared at him. Several seconds later, Barrett stood up, and while wiping his mouth with his hand, he started looking at Cyan and with a smile, told him that he had heard about him. He knew that Cyan had come back from the front lines. He asked if he wanted to join their little game. His friend simply crossed his arms and began staring intensely at Cyan with an aggressive look. Cyan turned his head slightly towards him, and while staring into his eyes, he began to wonder what ridiculous game he was talking about. He knew that the incorrect use of a mana marble could lead to the destruction of mana within the body. He turned his body towards him and asked if he was talking about the game where one had to force someone to eat a mana marble. Upon hearing this, both Barrett and his friends were somewhat confused. Cyan extended his hand to the side, causing a mana marble made of evil energy to appear in the palm of his hand. Upon seeing this, Barrett was terrified and began to wonder what was happening. In a matter of seconds, the mana marble that Cyan had summoned became enormous. While he had one hand in his pants pocket, he reached his hand towards the sky, and as the mana marble slowly grew even bigger, he asked Barrett what he was doing. Upon seeing this, Eren was terrified. Cyan began to stare at Barrett with a murderous look and ordered him to open his mouth. On the same day, Cyan, Eren, and Leximus returned to the academy and took Leximus to the infirmary. Several hours later, they went to Eren's room. While she was sitting on the bed, Eren explained that all her external injuries were almost healed, but she needed to rest in bed for her internal injuries to heal. While Cyan had his body leaning against the wall, he crossed his arms. Eren approached her, put her hands on her hips, and advised her to rest. While Leximus was looking at Eren, she couldn't help but blush and thanked both of them. She didn't know how to repay the favor. Eren started laughing and asked if she had seen how those bullies had run away when their Cyan scared them. Upon hearing this, Cyan became somewhat confused. Eren asked her not to worry, as they had only done what they were supposed to do. While Cyan stood with crossed arms, he began to look at Leximus and thought that she had fractures and a concussion. It was impressive that she had managed to endure all of this. He thought the reason was that the best swordsman on the continent was different from the others. Feeling Cyan's gaze, Leximus turned her head towards him and asked if he knew her. Upon hearing this, Cyan snapped out of his trance and was somewhat surprised. Quickly, Leximus looked away, and as she started to blush, she began looking at the ground and explained that she felt Cyan was still looking at her. While Cyan had his arms crossed, he closed his eyes and explained that he thought he knew her, but it turned out he didn't. He also apologized to her in case he had been unpleasant to her. Upon hearing this, Eren turned her head towards him and became somewhat confused. While Leximus was sitting on the bed and looking down, she replied that it was nothing. Eren turned her head towards her and became even more confused. Eren approached her with a worried look and asked her where her dormitory was. She didn't know if Barrett and his friends were going to bother her again, seeking revenge. Leximus looked up and explained to her that her dorm was in the commoner hall. Upon hearing this, Eren was somewhat surprised. While she was looking at Leximus, she asked her if she was a peasant. She started looking down at the ground, and she replied yes. She had enrolled in this academy specifically thanks to instructor Veltane, who had promised financial support throughout her schooling career, but he suddenly got fired. While Cyan had his body leaning against the wall and crossed his arms, he explained to Eren that, in other words, nobody was here to support Leximus, so maybe she would have to leave the academy. Eren turned her body towards Cyan and was somewhat surprised. Leximus replied that it was true. Upon hearing this, Eren began to look at Leximus with a sad expression. She brought her hand close to her face and felt sorry for her. Upon seeing this, Cyan turned his head towards Eren and asked her why she didn't simply take Leximus as her person to learn swordsmanship from while she was at it. Eren became somewhat confused. She turned her body towards Cyan and, while pointing at Leximus with her finger, asked him what he was talking about if Leximus was a boy. Cyan revealed to her that Leximus was a girl. Upon hearing this, Eren became both confused and surprised at the same time. While Leximus was sitting on the bed, she caught Eren's attention and explained to her that she didn't want to deceive her. She put her hand behind her head, looked away, and while blushing, she explained that having short hair and wearing boys' clothes was more comfortable for her, so many people mistook her for a boy. While Eren was crying, she joined the tips of her fingers, turned her body towards her, and apologized to Leximus since she hadn't even realized that Cyan knew it too. She felt like she had failed as a woman. Upon seeing this, Leximus reached out her hand towards her and told her that she should be the one apologizing. Eren approached Leximus and while looking into her eyes, asked for her opinion on whether Cyan's idea was good. She explained to her that if she accepted, then she wouldn't be mistreated by bad people. If she placed herself under Eren's care, then she could learn and become whatever she wanted and have a comfortable life. Leximus started looking down and asked Eren why she was choosing her. Eren began touching her cheek, looked away, and replied that she didn't like being alone, and she couldn't just do nothing since she was the princess. While Leximus was looking down, she thanked her. She lifted her head, placed her hand on her chest, and with a grateful look, she decided to make sure she became someone Eren could be proud of. After saying this, she thanked her again. While Leximus was wiping away tears with her finger, Eren began to turn her head back and told her that she didn't need to thank her since everything had been thanks to Cyan. As she turned her head back, she saw that Cyan had disappeared. Cyan left the academy and thought that he had already done enough. He was sure that Princess Eren would take care of the rest. Now he could see why Leximus had abandoned the Empire Ushif. She would have never lost her mana if it hadn't been for Barrett Lewismill, the best swordsman on the continent who never lost her mana. It was going to be difficult to defeat even for Cyan. Cyan put his hand in his pants pocket, closed his eyes, and decided to stop thinking about the subject since, anyway, his interest at the moment was elsewhere. This morning, Hall Master Serika had given him his first assignment. Cyan took out the card she had handed him and with a smile thought that this was his first purification mission as a member of Mist. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.